Welcome to Irregular Odes. I'm James Rendell and I'm a photojournalist. This is Tim Wilson, the former Australian Human Rights Commissioner between 2014 and 2016, giving the Isabelle Lake Lecture at the University of Western Australia. Tim Wilson is an Australian former politician and a member of the Liberal Party of Australia, who served as the federal member for Goldstein in the Australian House of Representatives from 2016 to 2022. Wilson served as the chair of the Standing Committee on Economics from 2018 to 2021 and as the Assistant Minister to the Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reductions from 2021 to 2022. In the 2022 Australian federal election, Wilson lost his seat to independent candidate Zoe Daniel. Before entering politics, Wilson was a policy director at the Institute of Public Affairs from 2007 to 2013. In March 2024, Wilson won the Liberal Party's pre-selection for the seat of Goldstein in the upcoming election, which will be held on or before the 22nd of September 2025. We hope you enjoy this video. Please like, share, subscribe and comment down below, and go to the website carearwen.org to see photo archives.
I'd like, of course, to begin by acknowledging the Noongar people's ongoing cultural connection to the land in which we meet today. It is, of course, a great pleasure to be invited to give the third Isabelle Lake Memorial Lecture. And I want to acknowledge the family who are here today, Sally and Bruce, and the other family members, as well as friends who have taken the time out to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the West Australian Equal Opportunity Commission and their ongoing leadership in challenging prejudice against lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex people in Australia's frontier state. And I say frontier state with absolute affection. Frontiers called pioneers. Pioneers are leaders of new territory and the seemingly unknown. As far as I am aware, this is the only annual lecture in the country dedicated to discussing issues that affect transgender Australians and, of course, a fitting memorial for one of West Australia's pioneering daughters. As you know, Lake transitioned shortly before tragically dying from a rare form of leukemia. Lake was a passionate advocate for LGBTI rights and freedoms. This lecture was established, of course, to honour her memory, but also to ensure the continuation of her all too short life's work. And that is the task before all of us, to ensure the experience of the next generation of trans Australians is better than those before, and to make sure Australia is a more open, supportive and inclusive country regardless of your sexual orientation or your gender identity. Some of you may have read the article that was just mentioned by Alana in the West Weekend magazine recently, covering Lake's story from being, quote, a miserable, isolated and confused Nick to a proud, a confident and contributing Isabelle. I found her story incredibly powerful. But behind the headline of her lived experience was, of course, the story of her family and the empathy that they showed and supported during her transition. Building empathy sits at the heart of improving the lives of transgender Australians and ensuring future generations enjoy a better life than those past. So I thought, in that context, I'd share with you how SOGI issues fit within my role as Human Rights Commissioner. And I'm not exactly shy of publicity, so some of you may have seen some of my commentary in the past. As Australia's sixth Human Rights Commissioner, I've taken a different approach from many of my predecessors. Many contemporary human rights advocates approach human rights as though they are gifts of international treaties negotiated by governments and to be negotiated by diplomats and to be interpreted by courts. I don't fit within that contemporary view. I believe in what I would call a classical liberal view of human rights. And by a classical liberal view and a classical liberal approach, recognises that the very concept of human rights is built on the compounded knowledge of thousands of years of philosophical reasoning about the basic liberties that all people possess as a consequence of their born faculties. They are built on the inherent dignity that comes with birth, and that every individual owns their own body and that they should be free to pursue their lives, their opportunities and their enterprise, so long as, of course, they do no harm to others. It's in this context the role of government is to establish formal equality. Formal equality is when each person is treated equally before the law and fairly by government. It's not the job of government and the law to tell people who they are. That's social engineering. It's the job of government and law to respect who people are. This classical liberal approach sits perfectly with respecting trans Australians. Underpinning this approach to human rights is a very strong commitment to bodily autonomy and that government should not discriminate between people. Of course, many contemporary human rights advocates are much more focused on advancing informal equality by using government to achieve outcomes. I am not opposed at all to focusing on advancing informal equality. The only right I put on that is not at the expense of formal equality, least because lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex Australians are still denied the latter. Shortly after my arrival at the Human Rights Commission on February 18 last year, I also took on, as Lana has mentioned, the role as de facto Commissioner for Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Intersex Status Issues. Anyone familiar with the structure of the Commission would know that we have commissioners for age, disability, race and sex discrimination, as well as a Children's Commissioner and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. SOGI issues have always been structurally absent from the Human Rights Commission's work. There is, of course, a natural synergy between serving as Human Rights Commissioner and also acting as a de facto SOGI Commissioner. LGBTI Australians still don't enjoy formal equality before the law and fair and equal treatment by government, as LGBTI Australians are actually unique. They face entrenched, state-sanctioned discrimination at both a state and a federal level, let alone issues that come as a consequence of informal equality. Of course, you will be familiar with many of these issues. Lesbian, gay, bisexual people are restricted from marrying their partners. Intersex Australians face horrific and forced gender assignment and sterilisation sometimes at birth. But the lingering and the most extensive discrimination is still faced by transgender Australians. In relationships where one partner of a married couple fully affirms their gender by law, the law necessitates a divorce. I can't think of anything more surreal and disturbing than the government and law breaks consensual, resilient families and relationships apart. But as this audience will know, there's similarly complex and difficult challenges faced in changing official documentation from birth certificates, driver's licences and passports, particularly across jurisdictions, not just domestically but internationally, to name a few. Then there's the lingering challenges from the gendered nature of the health system and how it diminishes a trans Australian's access to medical care. And that assumes that the medical system can actually provide the assistance people seek, something that is not always available. Of course, we have the Australian government guidelines on the reception of sex and gender, but much more we need to drive change through systems of government, and also particularly at a state level. And part of that requires very significant national coordination so that governments are working together and understanding and learning from the experiences of other governments. To commence this work, I announced last year that we would be completing, and by that I mean the Human Rights Commission, a national consultation to look at the legal and non-legal challenges faced in the SOGI portfolio. The report from these consultations will be launched soon. As part of this process, we held a series of public and targeted meetings to collect evidence and garner insights into the lived experience of LGBTI Australians. We also put a premium on collecting stories so we can give these often ignored voices a national platform. Because behind all human rights issues are human stories. In Brisbane, I met with the parents of trans teens. The parents joined PFLAG, seeking mutual support and understanding for their teens and also very much for themselves as they navigated their unexpected journey. Behind the discussion around doctors, access to medical services and the children's school experience was the universal Australian parent experience. These parents just wanted the best for their children and for them to live fulfilling and rich lives. And rather than letting stigma or social pressure define their families, they've been drawn together to create a new and different type of village to raise their children. Throughout our consultations, we heard from lots of parents that have faced these challenges, supported their children, and watched them blossom into adults that they always had hoped they would be. One parent wrote in the submission process that we love our daughter and her siblings and totally adore her for who she was grown into being and who she is. We can't even tell you what families have to go through, and this submission hasn't even scraped the surface of what our beautiful children have to endure on their journey through life. Another submission wrote that our son is keen to become an advocate and had taken on the leadership role in school as wellbeing captain. In his application speech to the school community, he spoke about how being transgender has made him stronger and more positive about his whole life. He suggested it has been helped him deal with difference and that he feels he can support other kids who equally feel different. We are, of course, extremely proud of him and fully aware that we are lucky to be who we are, living in an age where he's supported and encouraged to be who he is. Of course, not all stories are like that and don't fill you with a warm inner glow or tingling sensation. Many people, parents and children, continue to struggle because they can't get the support that they need. Another parent wrote, "My son is 17. He came out to be as being trans when he was 12 years old. Now looking back, he'd been struggling with his gender dysphoria from a very young age. Even now, life is a struggle for him every day. Afraid to leave the house, trouble at school, and wishing he was dead. He's been diagnosed with gender dysphoria and he's on puberty blockers. If he could get hormone therapy, testosterone, before he turns 18 years old and without going to court, he'd be healthier and he'd be happier. He tries to pass as male at high school, but his voice hasn't broken yet, even though he tries to keep his voice low. And he lacks facial hair and other features that testosterone would help him to pass as male. It's very frustrating and a suicide risk in my son's case that he's not male on his birth certificate and Centrelink. Medicare still regard him as female. I don't want him to have to be 18 and have surgery just so he can have the right gender marker." The content and the spirit of these reflections will be familiar to many people in the audience, and in some cases reflect your own lived experience. But it isn't just about individuals. Throughout our consultations, we met ordinary people doing extraordinary work. At the Alice Springs Women's Refuge, trans and intersex women were working to end domestic and physical violence in Alice and surrounding Aboriginal communities. They were only armed with courage and reason in the hope that they may be able to bridge a divide between ignorance and understanding. In remote communities, we've met with trans Aboriginal Australians facing cultural barriers and dealing with their unique stories of securing social acceptance as sister girls and brother boys. In Victoria, I met with Peter Ferguson. Peter Ferguson heads up an organisation called Brain Injury Matters, a non-government organisation dedicated to raising the profile of acquired brain injuries and provide support for those that live with them. Despite having her own brain injury, Peter Ferguson, as a trans woman, has done an exceptional job at setting up this organisation, bringing together the community and seeking to educate others about the challenges that she faces uniquely, but also to help others. In South Australia and Queensland, we met with clinical practitioners working to assist trans Australians navigate the hormonal path from gender assignment to affirmation. Many transgender Australians live lives of success where they can achieve their dreams for themselves and for their loved ones. But as we know, that isn't true for everybody. And at least at key stages of life, it is not always easy. Many trans Australians live decades struggling with the internal tension and anxiety of not having their psychological and physical gender in alignment. And it's complicated by the dual excitement and deep-seated fear of the life they might live if they seek to correct or align it. That fear is understandably driven by the honest assessment that you are different. Most people won't understand you and the unknown treatment you'll receive from your friends, from your family, and your society for your honesty. It's also, of course, backed up with real-world lived experience. According to the Private Lives 2 survey, around 40% of trans men and women experience some sort of verbal abuse, and around a quarter experience some form of harassment. More than 1 in 10 experience threats of physical violence or attacks. Depression rates are also disturbingly high, and according to the Trans Nation report, is being ameliorated by simple social engagement and the routine activity of having a normal, stable family, friendship, and work environment that too many of us take for granted. More recently, the first Australian National Trans Mental Health Study unsurprisingly found that of those that participated in the survey, 43.7% experienced clinically relevant depressive symptoms, and more than a quarter, at 28.8%, met the criteria for a current major depressive syndrome. Trans Australians appear to be four times more likely to have ever been diagnosed with depression than the general population. I'd like to say these results shock or surprise me, but of course they don't. As the chair of the National Mental Health Commission, Alan Fells wrote in The Australian last year, suicide and mental health problems in the LGBTI community are an enormous issue, but one that seems to be almost invisible. Until recently, both law and culture has been disinterested in the protection of trans Australians. It was, of course, only in 2013 that federal laws were changed to stop discrimination, and there is still a long road ahead in reforming all necessary state laws to respect lived reality. Though one of the significant achievements of the 2013 federal reforms is that the law is set at what would be argued as a gold standard, because it focuses on inclusive language, where it talks about sexual orientation, gender identity, and intersex status issues, unlike, for instance, the New South Wales state laws, which outlaws discrimination against people on the basis of homosexuality, but not on the basis of bisexuality. Of course, laws matter, We give a lot of deference to their power. They undoubtedly have an educative effect. But in practice, we also give them too much credit because they are easy to identify and they establish clear standards that we all hope for our society. It probably doesn't seem that way at the time, but getting legislative change is actually the easy bit. The necessary work to entrench a culture of respect is much more vague, organic, and harder to achieve. But it is also where the most fruitful work is done. Law is very successful at establishing a relationship between citizens and government. It is also effective at establishing legal frameworks for explicit relationships between people. But law is of 30 years we've essentially reversed thousands of years of historical, cultural and social understanding. The challenge is now to do the same for transgender people. Beyond Blue recently, and I think it's literally this morning, released a new advertisement under the theme of left-handedness. If you have not seen the advertisement, it portrays a left-handed young man facing constant stigma from his family, school and peers for his seeming difference. At the end of the advertisement, it asks a simple question: imagine being made to feel like crap just for being yourself. It's the same for gay, lesbian, bi, trans and intersex people. The things we can say and do cause anxiety and depression. In an interview on why this advertisement was pitched in this way, a Beyond Blue spokesperson identified that research, particularly amongst teenage males, showed that simply asserting the inappropriateness of discrimination or stigma on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity was not sufficient to change behaviour. Instead, the research concluded that the message had to be relatable and engender a degree of empathy. Sympathy, of course, is not the same as empathy. Sympathy is about one person feeling sorrow for the situation of another. Empathy is about being able to understand the situation of another. Empathy only comes through a degree of familiarisation. That is what the Beyond Blue advertisement seeks to achieve. Familiarisation is fundamentally important to advance the awareness, the mindfulness and the respect for trans Australians. Unfounded negative attitudes towards people who are different or unfamiliar to yourself only change when people have exposure and find the common ground between those they don't know and when they get to know them. Achieving that objective is not about simply passing a law or telling people they have to respect trans Australians. It requires connection and communication. It also requires all of us as individuals to take action where we can. My colleague Liz Broderick is fond of saying, you can't be what you can't see. And that's why McGregor's contribution matters so much. She is, of course, not the first trans Australian to make a significant national contribution. But her preparedness to be candid and open is immensely important for a generation looking at what they can see so they know what they can be. She has become a beacon for others to shine a light on the gap between the sea of their confused thoughts or discomfort, anxiety or depression and a safe harbour that provides the security for a prosperous future. I understand it is the first time a trans Australian appeared on that program, and of course she's probably one of the few that appears on national media. Her Australian story, Call Me Kate, was transformative television for many Australians, particularly with the warm and very welcome introduction from our Prime Minister, Tony Abbott. McGregor's story, of course, is not alone. It's these human stories that are, of course, writing the pages of Australia's transgender awakening and acting as the building blocks of a culture of respect. But we have many more bricks to lay. They aren't, of course, sitting alone. The High Court challenged by Norrie in New South Wales around New South Wales gender identity laws was equally important. And I've spoken extensively with Norrie, and I'm very proud of Norrie's achievements. Importantly, trans Australians have a responsibility, though, to be mindful that other Australians are going through their own awakening and learning how to fully respect trans Australians for the first time. The role of trans Australians is to foster this experience, not to condemn people for putting a foot wrong. When McGregor appeared on Q&A last October, a series of tweets appeared on the screen from appraising Jeff Cooper, who extolled that, quote, "wow, she/he is a hero," end quote. Some people, including some trans Australians, understandably felt this language was insensitive, that it did not appreciate how trans people like to be addressed, and they're right. Cooper's tweets were unfortunate, but his praiseworthy intention was clear. Impatience for perfection doesn't bring it any closer or more familiar. Familiarity breeds understanding about how best to address people with respect, not beating people over the head when they mean well. It's precisely why discussion needs to be free and open. No one becomes more familiar through censorship or by being hounded down. Everybody, of course, needs to learn things for the first time. That includes individuals, that includes institutions. The seemingly complicated use of pronouns and the different trans Australians want, depending on whether they want to be respected and pass as their affirmed gender or be known as a trans person, or for no gender at all, is not straightforward for those who don't have that lived experience. Even human rights commissioners occasionally don't get it right. It is important that trans Australians have as much empathy for other Australians to help engender empathy for themselves as well. The other significant reason that we must engender empathy is because it builds the alliance for change. The Prime Minister's introduction to Corby Kate didn't occur because he had a distant and unknown relationship with McGregor. It occurred precisely because there was a pre-established relationship and she was in a position to explain her story. Similarly, some of the most empathetic and emphatic supporters of the interests of trans Australians that I have met have been from religious communities who don't draw moral guidance on trans people from Scripture, but look to a shared human experience instead. Of course, that isn't always universally true. The story of human advancement, though, is never built solely on the actions of one political movement, a group, or an individual. It is built on the collective efforts of people individually and collectively seeking change, and the full spectrum of supporters they gather along the way. Like the felling of a tree, social and cultural change doesn't occur through a singular strike, but through the gradual chipping away from different angles, all faced roughly in the same direction and toward the same common purpose. That is the task for all of us who want to see trans people as just that, people, with common bonds and a shared humanity that through knowledge and experience we can all empathise with. It's this spirit that will help drive reform to address many of the significant challenges that we still face. We need to engage with teachers and students about creating safe and respectful schools environments, improving access to information for individuals and parents of children that question their gender, and providing support. Cooperating with sporting and civil society organisations to encourage, but also foster, trans participation as equals. Sufficient and appropriate research to improve understanding and awareness of the unique challenges faced by trans Australians. Working with the academy and the educational and medical fraternity to build into formal education awareness for the unique challenges that are faced by trans Australians. To de-gender the social and welfare systems and health systems So when they are updated, they properly allow for respect of trans people. Working with existing health practitioners to improve their understanding about how to assist trans Australians that present questioning their gender. Developing policies and practices in workplaces to ensure trans Australians are able to make their maximum contribution. And cooperating with aged care facilities and their staff, often from different cultural backgrounds, to respect and support trans individuals and couples at one of the most vulnerable stages of their lives. It's these efforts that will turn the aspiration of many of our lives into a lived culture. I am not going to dispute that there is a long road ahead, but after hundreds, if not thousands of years of history of barely taking a single step, at least we can now say we are walking in the right direction. In her induction into the WA Women's Hall of Fame, Isabelle was described as, quote, a passionate, not bitter, in her response to life and very driven to help those impacted by life challenges who were not treated fairly. Her star burnt briefly, but brightly. This is a motto we should all aspire to live by. It's one we will all need to take as to turn Australia's transgender awakening into a culture of lived respect. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this video, please share, like, comment and subscribe. Check out our website at carearwen.org and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.